Alright, this is going to be video 2 for our Unit 13. Get ourselves set up here. Can I get myself angled here? Alright, here we go. Foreign policy of Reagan. Reagan wanted to restore U.S. military might and superpower prestige and to intensify the Cold War competition with Soviets. So he basically tries to reinvigorate the Cold War, and the 1980s Cold War felt like it was back kind of like in the 50s, much more aggressive, much more tense, especially in his first term. He even called them the evil empire and was prepared to back it up with military force if need be. He also believed that America should do limited military intervention in areas to also make sure basically Americans' ideas about, anti-communist views and so on should be upheld. So look at the military buildup first. Reagan spent billions to improve the weapons of the U.S. and expand the Navy. Famously, and we already talked about the massive increase in defense spending, but this is why he does it. He does it to basically try to intimidate the Soviets and make these guys not able to compete. He wanted to spend so much money that the Soviets would have to trail behind and would force them to negotiate or have to make some kind of deal or even collapse because they couldn't necessarily compete with our production levels, which is why he does the military buildup. Famously, he creates this program called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the press nicknamed Star Wars. This is supposed to be a high-tech system of lasers and missile defense shielding to prevent missiles from reaching the United States. You can kind of see a diagram of this here. But the idea is that missiles would be shot out of the air with lasers or other rockets that we have and prevent them from attacking Americans from Soviet territories and so on. It never really got fully realized, but it put a lot of pressure on the Soviets. So that's the biggest impact of this, is that SDI never really got made, but it makes a lot of pressure on the Soviets to try to keep up and try to basically develop something along their own to combat this to combat this, but they never really will be able to, which forces them to eventually negotiate more with us in the future. In 1983, we had an incident in Grenada. Reagan sent Marines to this island in the Caribbean to remove a pro-Cuban communist regime that had been installed there recently after a military coup. America was very successful, and Reagan got a lot of prestige as a result of our little invasion of Grenada, which was very brief. But later in his administration, his second term, Reagan faced a big blunder and a big scandal called the Iran-Contra affair. At that point, the biggest scandal since Watergate. So, Iran and Iraq were fighting since 1980. Reagan aides developed a secret plan. This is not Reagan himself, but aides of Reagan developed a secret plan to sell anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran's government for them to help release Americans who were held hostages by Iranian radicals. So, long story short, because of there was a lot of radicalism that was happening in Iran, there had been some Americans who had been taken hostage in the years before all this. This is unrelated to the Iranian hostage crisis, something different. These are different hostages. Anyway, these Reagan aides felt like, well, we can just basically sell them weapons to the government of Iran to get these hostages released, which proved successful. The aides then had the idea to use this money to help pay rebels in Nicaragua to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. So the government in Nicaragua was led by this group called the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas was this pro-communist, pro-left-leaning Marxist regime who Reagan wanted gone, it happened under Carter, but Carter didn't get these guys removed, and Reagan wanted these guys gone. So Reagan's aides decided that they were going to give money to the rebels there called Contras, and basically let these guys help overthrow the Sandinistas, which is why it's called the Iran-Contra affair. So we made money off of the Iran arms deal, which we then gave that money to the Contras to help overthrow the government. Why I do all this? Because Congress had told us that we couldn't give money to the Contras back in '85. So when this all blows up and becomes national media, and goes in the national media and so on, Reagan denied all knowledge of the illegal diversions of funds because it violated the congressional authority over the budget. Reagan came off as he was not involved in the scandal, but he came off as being easily manipulated by his advisors as a result, and his popularity took a hit as a result. Although it will return by the time he leaves office, it just makes Reagan look kind of aloof. Some people thought like it was a smart, kind of sneaky idea because it kind of went around Congress's money power, but either way, pretty much illegal type handling. One of the biggest faces of all this was Colonel Oliver North, who got a lot of the blame for all this, kind of orchestrating these deals in the military for all this. But mostly Reagan's aides got hit for this, and not Reagan himself. But nevertheless, a big scandal. Then you had another situation in Lebanon with Israel and the PLO. Israel in 1982 had decided to invade Lebanon right above it because PLO terrorists were located there. And I don't know how much I've talked about this in the past, but the PLO were the Palestinian Liberation Organization. These Palestinians wanted control over Israel. They felt like they were the rightful rulers over Israel, led by a guy named Yasser Arafat. Well, they were kicked out of Israel, and they were operating in Lebanon, doing these terrorist attacks into Israel. So Israel goes into Lebanon in 82 to get these guys removed out. America decides to get themselves involved to kind of help evacuate. So we don't go to the fight. We go in there to help evacuate these Palestinians, because not all the Palestinians in Lebanon were terrorists or bad guys. We're trying to get them relocated somewhere else to get them to a safe haven. But it showed that terrorism became more and more of a concern for us, because in April of 83, a suicide bomber killed 63 people at an American embassy. Months later, a terrorist drove a bomb truck into a Marines barracks, killing 241 American servicemen there as well. So America withdrew after all this took place without really having the issue resolved. But it shows more Middle Easterners being more upset with us intervening into affairs happening in the Middle East and wanting us not be part of this either. Then you have our relations with the Soviets. So in 1985, the Soviet Union got a new leader, its final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, he's going to prove to be a dynamic reformer, and he's going to be the main reason why the Soviets end up having the changes that they have. Two major reforms that Gorbachev enacts, and you can see a picture of Gorbachev here and him working with Reagan here as well too. The first one is called Glasnost, which means openness, which would end political repression and move to less censorship inside the Soviet Union, and allow for more freedom of expression, more freedom of the press. So the whole idea of Glasnost is to give the people of the Soviet Union more expression, more abilities to criticize the government. Because if they can criticize the government, they can call attention to the issues the government has and try to make improvements. So that was one big change that he makes. The second big change that he makes is perestroika, which means restructuring. It's a restructuring of the Soviet economy with limited free market practices and Soviet politics with limited local voting. So basically, perestroika introduces limited democracy and free market economy into the Soviet Union. Free market economy in the sense that you could have small stores owned by Soviets that they actually could make and keep profits from, and then low-level democracy where they actually could have local elections and vote on local leaders, which basically perestroika and glasnost lay the foundation for the collapse of the Soviet Union, because within 5-6 years the whole country collapses. When they get a taste of these institutions, it's only a matter of time before those institutions become bigger and help the entire system fall apart. Gorbachev also met with Reagan in his second term to help end this new arms race Reagan had developed in his first term to kind of bring things down. And together they made an INF treaty. So the INF treaty is another example of a arms reduction treaty made in 1987, which limited a specific type of nuclear missiles, intermediate range nuclear missiles, which is the INF part. Gorbachev also got Soviets to leave Afghanistan in 1988. Gorbachev had to do all these things in order to help a failing Soviet economy. By 1989, our relationship with the Soviets had vastly improved between the two superpowers, and the end of the Cold War seemed near, which it was. It was only about 2 years away at that point. But a lot of that's due to Gorbachev's dealings and not necessarily to Reagan. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost and his reform attitude helped the Soviets make better reforms and help the government eventually lead to changes. One last thing that takes place that's not really related to Reagan is Poland solidarity. In 1980, Polish laborers formed a trade union, the first of its kind in any communist-held country, led by a man named Lech Walesa, this man right here. This is a big deal because most of the time trade unions were squashed by communist governments. Despite the persecution and opposition of the government, Solidarity survived and became a powerful voice for the people. And it's one of the major institutions that eventually led to the downfall of communism in Eastern Europe. First in Poland, and other countries like Poland formed trade unions like Solidarity and began to push for changes in there as well too. So it was the first independent union to form in a communist country, inspired many and formed the basis of nonviolent anti-communist movement in Eastern Europe. And with that, we end Reagan and we move on to his successor, the Vice President, George H.W. Bush, who becomes the president. So look at the election 1988. Vice President Bush ran on the success of Reagan, even though he didn't possess some of the same charisma as Reagan. He called Democrats soft on crime and weak on national defense. He also famously said in the 88 election, "Read my lips, no new taxes," which he's going to have to later go back on that promise. But in the 88 election, he famously helped win his campaign on the "Read my lips, no new taxes" promise. Democrats picked the expressionless Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Republicans won with a margin of 7 million votes and captured most of the white middle-class voters. Democrats still held Congress, but it gridlocked Washington for the next 4 years, which sent a fairly mixed message to the country. Or the country sent a mixed message to Washington as a result. This was the last election also, too, that the moral majority or religious right had big impact. So we'll look first at the end of the Cold War under Bush. So in spring of '89, kind of sensing how things were beginning to shift around in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, pro-democracy students demonstrated in Beijing for freedom as well. So in this area in China, in Beijing, called Tiananmen Square, they had these students begin to do these protests for pro-democracy. But the government wasn't having that. TV crews from around the world were broadcasting these protests all across the world, including to America and Europe. The Chinese government, though, crushed this protest with tanks killing hundreds, and it ended this brief opening of a political environment in China. But you do have this very famous picture that emerges where this lone tank man stood in front of these tanks before he was later removed. To this day, we don't know who this guy was, but this very famous image came out of the Tiananmen Square protest. But China basically squashes any type of pro-democratic reform, unlike the Soviets, who had made or were beginning to make some reforms in their own country. So China, no changes. Eastern Europe. So in the late 80s, Gorbachev announced he'd no longer support Eastern European countries with Soviet troops, which means Soviet troops would begin to remove themselves from Eastern European countries. In '89, Poland elected Lech Walesa as their first president, and each communist country in Eastern Europe fell one by one. By November of 1989, East Germany tore down the Berlin Wall, and in October of 1990, Germany was finally reunited. So for the first time since the end of World War II, Germany became a reunited country once again. And this also saw the end of the Warsaw Pact. It also fell apart as well. Then you have the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Swift events and nationalist desires for self-determination overwhelmed the USSR. Because remember, the USSR was not just Russia. It was actually a combination of like 12 or 13 countries that had been formed back in the 1920s. In 1990, states began to declare independence from the Soviets, including Estonia, Latvia, and more. Hardliners tried to overthrow Gorbachev and reinstitute a harder Soviet Union, but it failed. And by December of 1991, all republics left the Soviet Union, including Russia itself, which didn't elect Gorbachev as its new leader. They instead elected a guy named Boris Yeltsin. So Boris Yeltsin became the new president of Russia, and Russia tried to become a democracy and free economy over the 90s and several decades. But we know they struggle with this, and Putin's coming to power now, and they're still struggling to figure out what they are, but they're not really like us in terms of free democracy and free economics. Then you had the results. In 91, Bush and Gorbachev signed a very important arms reduction treaty called START 1 in 1991. This is replacing SALT. START 1 reduced the number of nuclear warheads to under 10,000 for each country. And a few years later, Bush and the new Russian leaders signed a START 2 treaty, which brought the number down eventually to 3,000. And so the START treaties actually just went up a few years ago, and now as a result, START has a big impact on our country to recent times, because it's the most recently impactful nuclear reduction treaty. It was hard, though, for Bush and the United States to celebrate the end of the Cold War because of how things were developing in these previous Soviet Union-dominated countries in Eastern Europe as well as the Middle East. Civil wars broke out, a lot of violence broke out. So as soon as the Cold War ended, there was already other issues taking its place. And at home, questions were being raised if the United States needed to keep this heavy defense spending. Now the Cold War's over. Should we keep spending the amount of money we're spending right now on defense and reduce it, since now we're in a peacetime, more or less? But that continues to be a question that we have even to right now. So that's where we're going to end video 2.